Hello, everybody. Welcome to this launch webinar for our new report, The Role of Traceability in Critical Mineral Supply Chains, which is a joint report of the IEA and the OECD. We're very pleased to present this to you today. But first, we will start with an intro from Jeffrey Biggs, who is a... Please, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the IEA and the OECD's recent report on traceability in critical mineral supply chains. In addition to being the Senior Director of the International Affairs and Trade Division within the Lands and Minerals sector at Natural Resources Canada, I'm also the Canadian delegate on the IEA's Critical Minerals Working Party, where Canada co-leads the ESG task force with France. We're very grateful for the IEA and the OECD's leadership in this space, and really pleased to be able to participate in the support for their work on this front. This report underscores that critical mineral supply chains cannot be truly secure, reliable, or resilient unless they were also sustainable, responsible, and fully traceable across the entire value chain. As you well know, the demand for critical minerals is forecast to skyrocket in the coming years, and the concentration of supply by non-market-based players presents enormous challenges to global supply chain resiliency. It's in this context that so many individuals and actors share significant due diligence concerns that have been emerging and are collective supply chain resiliency. And this has inspired an increasing number of international engagements in recent years relating to traceability. In fact, I just got back from the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada convention, whether you call it PDAC or PDAC. It was great to see some of you in Toronto, where we had a session on the margins of the convention on traceability for secure critical mineral value chains. There's clear momentum in this area, and reports like this one help to keep driving this work forward. This report confirms that traceability can and does play an important role in strengthening energy security and ensuring that sustainable and responsible supply chains are supported by strong due diligence. Authors from both the OECD and IEA are with us today to present their findings, and there will be an opportunity for questions and discussion after their presentation. Thank you again for joining us today. There's a lot to cover, so without any fewer words, I will pass the floor to the report's authors. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. So we will now begin with a presentation of the report. And just to provide a little bit more context from the IEA's side, we released in December 2023 a report on sustainable and responsible supply chains. And we had a short discussion in that report on traceability and on the role for traceability in supply chain transparency. And that short section generated a lot of questions and various comments from different readers, basically asking if we could elaborate. So based on that feedback, we decided to explore this topic in greater depth this year with a dedicated report on the role of traceability. And really, this was driven by the desire to understand what role traceability can play, both in the sustainable and responsible kind of ESG set of concerns, but also what those implications might be for security of supply. But given the longstanding expertise in supply chain transparency and due diligence by our colleagues at the OECD, we decided to partner with them for this report. And that's why it's now a joint publication of the IEA and the OECD. And we're very pleased to present this report together with colleagues from the OECD today. So I'm happy now to introduce the team of authors from the IEA. In addition to myself, I'm joined by Joyce Raboka, Felix Gagnon, and Alex Hegarty. And from the OECD, we're joined by Ben Katz and Luca Maiotti. And with that, I'll pass the floor over to the team to present the report, beginning with Felix.
Yeah, hello everybody. Traceability is a word that has been used a lot in recent years. So we thought that as part of the report, we could start by really trying to define what traceability is and help people understand what this concept means. So the initial part of our report delves into what traceability is. And what we found is that traceability is the capacity to obtain certain information regarding a particular product. In order for a product to really be traceable, what we found is that you have to collect at least 4 minimum elements. And those 4 minimum elements are origin, so where the product comes from, geographical path, so where the product has traveled, chain of custody, so who has handled the product, and physical evolution, so what modifications the product has undergone throughout the supply chain. If you don't have these 4 minimum elements, the product can only be said to be partially traceable. You need these 4 minimum elements for the product to be truly traceable. And if you track these 4 elements, that will enable you to follow the movement of the product throughout the supply chain. But it's not sufficient to only collect these 4 minimum elements that I just talked about. What you also need to do is you need to verify them, because if you don't actually verify the data that you collect, then you risk having some data that is fraudulent or inaccurate. So a part that is very important in traceability is to actually verify data. And in addition to these 4 basic elements that I just mentioned, you can also use traceability systems to pass along information on ESG. So you can attach ESG data in order to provide some information regarding the product's ESG performance. So for example, if you trace minerals that are incorporated into a battery, that can give you an idea of the battery's ESG performance. So having introduced what traceability is, we're going to move on to the next slide. So yeah, as I just said, if you establish a traceability system, that can allow you to obtain certain basic elements regarding a product, namely mine origin, its path, who has owned it, how it has evolved, and also potentially ESG data. And so now I will turn to my colleague Joyce Raboka to give an overview of what this data can be used for and what goals it can be used to achieve.
Thanks, Felix. There are many reasons why this would be desirable for companies to have a traceability system, as well as this data that feeds into the traceability system. First would be, as you can see in that list, to facilitate product differentiation, and it helps companies distinguish their products from others so that it would allow the end user to be more informed about their purchases. Second, and we'll talk about this later on in the presentation, is to meet regulatory requirements and targets for incentives. Third is to support pricing differentiation. Companies can use this data to demonstrate provenance and high ESG performance, and it can explain why prices are higher for certain products. The fourth would be even if traceability won't be required of companies might still want to have a traceability system to obtain clarity and information and avoid potential reputational risk. And at the same time, this traceability systems can serve as a tool for attaining policy goals. There's a list there, but two of which we would like to highlight is to establish a secure and diverse supply chain for energy security, and in case of sanctions or control, you can monitor the trade flows as well with the traceability system. I'll hand it over to Ben Katz from the OECD as well for this slide.
Thanks, Joyce. And just to say, yeah, I really hope that this report also marks the beginning of enhanced IEA OECD cooperation on critical minerals. I think this presents a great case in point, also looking at these different policy lenses. So, of course, one of the policy goals that Joyce just touched on and is a focus of the report is on achieving more responsible and sustainable mineral supply chains. So on due diligence and as a way to achieve this, that of course Jeff mentioned as well, OECD standards on responsible business conduct set out a 6-step due diligence process so that enterprises can identify, prevent, and mitigate adverse impacts throughout the supply chain that they may be causing or may be linked to through other business relationships. And these could comprise conflict financing, for example, human rights violations, corruption and integrity risks, environmental risks, as well as labor rights violations. And all of these, of course, besides being adverse impacts in themselves, can, of course, be very disruptive to supply and affect resilience of mineral supply chains as well. Now, due diligence is risk-based, meaning that companies should prioritize the most significant risks. And to begin to understand what risks companies could be linked to, the OECD due diligence guidance on responsible mineral supply chains calls on companies to establish a system of controls and transparency. And so that's part of what you see here in terms of the concepts on this slide. This could entail chain of custody, it could entail supply chain mapping, and it could also entail traceability, which of course is the only concept which has that minimum definition of the points that Felix set out at the beginning. These do comprise different levels of effort, but all relate to the notion of supply chain transparency in the OECD guidance. Now, given the complexity of the supply chain, the report, I think, does a good job of showing how these concepts can be used to deploy traceability where it is most useful. And this also gets to the notion of transparency. So, of course, so there's kind of a contrast that we should note between supply chain transparency, which could comprise traceability, chain of custody, supply chain mapping, as well as product transparency, which you see here. And product transparency is also really important, and of course, traceability can support this. This really corresponds to step 5 in OECD standards on responsible business conduct, and that's the efforts that companies make to disclose their due diligence exercise. So what have they done to respond to risks? This could comprise, of course, a lot of ESG related information. And in any case, traceability in this context as a tool to support effective due diligence can or really should start a process through due diligence to start improving conditions in the supply chain. It shouldn't be the end of a compliance exercise. It should really mark the beginning so that we can take that information that we can glean from it and try to improve conditions in the supply chain. We can move on to the next slide. So this slide is about how regulations and market requirements are really stimulating the uptake of traceability. So since traceability can be so important to supporting due diligence, there are a lot of emerging regulations on due diligence that may stimulate more investment into traceability and uptake of it. So I'm thinking of regulations really across the world. They're probably the most recent ones, like the battery regulation, as well as the so-called conflict minerals regulation in the EU, that may relate the closest to these concepts, but there are others as well in North America. There are market requirements like on the London Metal Exchange. So while most of these regulations do not directly call for or mandate traceability, they do open the door to different forms of supply chain transparency. And of course, by establishing traceability, that can really ease compliance with many of these regulations. And I'll pass on to Joyce for the rest of the slide. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So in addition to, like Ben said, there are regulations that are increasing that could encourage traceability. Besides due diligence and product passports and platforms, we also have economic incentives. And this could be those that require or rather to get tax incentives and tax incentives, you would need a percentage of the material in the product to be from a domestic source, for example. Circularity requirements are also on the rise, where there's a requirement of a percentage of the product to be from recycled material. And lastly, we also have seen prohibitions on content from certain sources for national security reasons. What are the implications of these regulations? So with these regulations on the rise, then we would need a more efficient and effective method for complying with such obligations. And eventually, this could be crucial for market access and competitiveness of the products. Also, the trend, as you can see, is for increased transparency. And we would need tools and technologies to monitor adherence to these regulations. And an example of this would be through a traceability system, which we have components for which we have outlined and described in our report. And I'll go on to the next slide for Luca Maiotti and Alex Hegarty to explain that more.
Thanks, Joyce. So to actually achieve traceability, there must be a traceability system to collect and transmit that data across supply chains. These systems will differ depending on the context and type of supply chains, which we will talk about later, but all share the fact that they must be thoughtfully designed to balance added value, robustness, and practicality while maintaining credibility at a proportionate cost. So to do this, a system must have 4 key components. So firstly, in order for these systems to be effective, they must enable supply chains to transmit data that is accurate, reliable, and trustworthy. This requires certain data input requirements that are agreed upon and standardized across the supply chain, which can be facilitated by organizations such as the ISO with their guidelines on data management and exchange, or the Global Battery Alliance with their battery passport technical guidance. As we've discussed earlier, it's also possible to attach sustainability data to traceability systems, but this must be carefully considered as some types of this data may be more suitable for collection through traceability systems than others. For example, environmental data, while of course not easy to collect and quantify, might be easier to collect and quantify than other type of data, such as compliance with social standards or more complex governance issues. The second component that we'd like to touch on is the technical infrastructure, which is required for reliable data management, secure storage, and physical tagging mechanisms to link the actual records with actual materials. So there are a wide range of tools and strategies for infrastructure, which range from paper-based methods like mine origin certificates to technologies for digital track and trace systems, such as material tagging and fingerprinting, which is then captured in digital record systems like blockchain to transmit information along the supply chain. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages, which are important to weigh. So one important consideration that I would like to highlight is the cost, which is often concentrated upstream and may vary significantly depending on several factors. So one factor that influences cost is the type of technology used and the complexity and specific requirements of a company's supply chain. Costs may also be high for companies that have minimal or non-existent data infrastructure. And conversely, would be less for companies with existing data management systems, which might find it easier, less costly, with less high significant upfront costs and physical and human capital. However, it may also be the case that this high implementation and maintenance costs are offset by improvements in data management systems and operational efficiencies, as well as if they contribute to making overall due diligence processes more effective by anticipating and preventing risks. Lastly, I just want to highlight one last important consideration for technical infrastructure, which is interoperability, which allows for different traceability systems to talk to each other and for data exchange across different systems. So it's important to support interoperability so that this can happen along the supply chain. I'll now hand the floor over to Luca to talk about the second two components of an effective traceability system.
Thanks. So in addition to the elements outlined by Alex, supply chain collaboration is key for an effective traceability system to facilitate the flow of information, to ensure interoperability of individual companies' system, and where appropriate, to set up cost-sharing agreements. Now, in practice, there are significant challenges when it comes to collaboration. Commercial confidentiality concerns are not always well defined, and there is a risk that this issue becomes a pretext for opacity, and or alternatively, these are being overlooked, these concerns. So at a minimum, even accounting commercial sensitivity issues, traceability systems should allow the companies in the upstream part of the supply chain, the smelters, the refiners, the upstream traders, to collect information on the mine of origin, and downstream companies, so the original equipment manufacturers, the consumer-facing companies, to identify the country of origin so they can run risk assessments and red flag assessments. Industry associations and sustainability initiatives can help to support collaboration. Broadly, there are two types of sustainability initiatives that are relevant for traceability. Facilitation initiatives help deliver and transmit traceability information, while verification initiative check on the results of the information that is generated. So both of them can play a role when it comes to supply chain collaboration. Another key component of an effective traceability system is its capability to account for corruption. We've heard it from Felix at the beginning. Traceability systems are only as reliable as the data they receive. So if they receive inaccurate or fraudulent data, they will simply replicate it and pass it on through the supply chain. The verification challenge is even more significant when it comes to sustainability or ESG issues. Fraudulent audit results or compliance certificates that are secured through business-to-business corruption or bribes to inspectors can infiltrate the system and compromise its reliability. So to combat these risks, effective traceability systems can benefit from multiple layers of verification and assurance to enhance data reliability, but nuance and context awareness is key. Auditing each supplier at each stage of the supply chain or imposing advanced technological solutions will not deliver results and simply increase costs where the governance environment is weak. I'll hand it back to Alex to give us an overview of different supply chain features and how do they relate to traceability.
Thanks, Luca. So when considering traceability systems for critical minerals, it's important to recognize that each commodity has distinct features. Sorry, Joyce, next slide. Has distinct features and potential risks. And policymakers should be mindful of these differences when developing or assessing the use of traceability initiatives. So I'm going to highlight three key considerations for the specific minerals. So the first, I would say, is geographical concentration. So the location of operations, mining, refining, or processing varies quite significantly among different commodities. And solutions for traceability must be adapted to local infrastructure, the regulatory environments, and potential logistical obstacles within each of those supply chains. So, for example, if there are a lot of remote sites or ASM in that supply chain, then an intensive traceability system may not be as appropriate. The second is supply chain complexity. So some commodities like copper undergo multiple technically complex processing steps and involve a large number of companies that produce quite small quantities across the supply chain. Copper is also subject to blending during smelting and refining, leading to multiple end uses across a global network of supply. In contrast, other minerals such as nickel are also highly concentrated, but are concentrated amongst just a few producers, meaning that there are more players. There are a smaller number of players producing a smaller quantity or a larger quantity in the market. And the last one is the type of risk. So the type of risk matters for the type of and level of traceability. Under the OECD minerals guidance, the measures that a company takes to conduct due diligence should be equal with the severity and likelihood of adverse impact, which might be different across multiple different minerals and mean that it may be more or less relevant to conduct traceability in those supply chains. And I will pass it back to Luca.
Thanks, Alex. And in this slide, we wanted to give a flavor of how traceability may look like in reality across one of the supply chains. Here you see an overlay of a supply chain viewer that is managed by the NGO Resource Matters. This is only based on public information, so it cannot claim to be exhaustive and complete, but it does cover more than 200 companies. So it gives, I think, an appropriate idea of how the supply chain is structured and works. And we overlay this with the due diligence process that Ben outlined earlier. On the right-hand side, we see that the step one of the due diligence guidance is for the expectations for companies to set up management systems, and this include coming up with a policy, staffing appropriately a due diligence team, but also set up a system of transparency and controls over the supply chain that spans traceability, chain of custody, identification of upstream suppliers, depending on where the company is sitting in the supply chain and on its risk profile. This is important because this traceability information will be used by companies to identify risks of adverse impacts. And once they have identified and prioritized them, they will mitigate them. At the fourth step, again, another point where traceability information can be generated is the expectations for a audit of due diligence systems at smelters and refining point. And then the fifth step, as Ben also mentioned, when it comes to product transparency, is the expectation to disclose on all the steps of the due diligence process. So once again, using traceability helps, let's say, as to support and as part of the broader due diligence process, helps to prioritize the most significant risks, generate data on beneficial ownership, for example, deep in supply chains, and so refine, improve risk assessments and risk mitigation, ultimately improving conditions in supply chains. If we can switch to the next slide, please. Here, we looked at implementation of past in traceability initiatives, both in the mineral sector, but also in other sectors. For example, agriculture, food, and food industries. And we outlined some of these lessons learned. You see here on the screen. The first one is that risk-based approach is key. Traceability systems must take into account the risk of fraudulent or inaccurate data, with some supply chains requiring more structured verification than others. So where the risk of fraudulent misrepresentation is higher, a more structured traceability system or chain of custody system may be appropriate, while maybe a paper trail chain of custody will be sufficient in lower risk environments. It's important to think about barriers to access and incentives. traceability systems must take into account the structural barriers that are faced by smaller economic actors or informal economic actors when it comes to access to finance, access to digital infrastructure, sometimes even physical infrastructure. So governments that are willing to implement mandatory traceability requirements will need to think about that and think about the supporting measures that they can provide to smaller actors and potentially even adapt some of the traceability requirements. Interoperability, we've heard it. It's another big issue, especially when looking to establish end-to-end traceability. We know that cross-industry alignment and collaboration on interoperability standards can help. We've seen this happening, for example, in the seafood or the solar industry in order to help solve this challenge. And then when it comes to the type of data, we've heard that traceability system can include certain information that is related to sustainability. Some of this data may be relatively easy to quantify, but other types of data may require additional verification. And as always with sustainability indicators, we know that these are proxies to assess the company performance and reality, but of course their relevance depends on their ability to accurately reflect what is going on the ground. And sometimes these can vary quite widely. The fifth point is the quality of data. It is just as important to guarantee the reliability of the data as it is to implement secure methods for exchanging information. Speaking also concretely, government-issued documentation alone may not be enough, for example, in all cases. So monitoring the rule of law and allegations can help ensure that the information that is inserted in traceability system is accurate. Verification initiatives can also help on this, but their credibility depends on factors such as their governance structure, to what extent they include stakeholders in part of the verification or design of the initiative, and how they hold companies accountable or how they disclose information. And then the fifth one, as we mentioned, is the cross-border supply chain challenges. We've already touched on limited access to technology, the reluctance of some of the midstream operators to pass information, and the data prohibition laws the data protection laws that prohibit disclosure of traceability data. I'll hand it over to Felix for an overview of the roadmap that is in chapter 6 of the report.
Yeah, thanks, Luca. So with these challenges and these lessons learned that Luca just talked about, we thought we could develop a roadmap for countries that are interested in boosting effective mineral traceability. Companies obviously have a huge role to play in setting up and operating traceability systems, but governments also have some tools at their disposal that they can use to encourage operators to develop those systems and operate them. And so we have this roadmap that we've developed that is intended for governments to boost effective mineral traceability. As you can see, the first 4 steps are really meant to help countries understand the context and decide what to focus on. So the first things that countries should do is to determine what policy objective they're trying to accomplish with traceability. And once you've decided that, you can decide what to focus in terms of products, which information needs to be collected and shared by operators, which operators need to be covered by the traceability system. So, for example, if you're a country that has a large lithium producing industry, you may find it more logical to focus on lithium producers within your jurisdiction and encourage those operators to trace minerals or establish mechanism to prove the provenance of their mineral when they export them abroad. The remaining 5 steps are more tools that countries have at their disposal to actually boost mineral traceability. So the first tool that we have is to promote the development and use of interoperability protocols, because as my colleague Alex was saying, interoperability remains a major challenge to traceability with different operators using different systems. And so countries can promote the development or use of these protocols with common technical standards and common information standards to encourage operators to trace their products. The second thing that countries can do is to establish trust mechanism. So governments are typically seen as more credible, and so one of the things that they can do is to issue certain documents as verifiable digital credentials to prove certain elements of traceability. So, for example, one of the things that we've seen, for example, in British Columbia, Canada, is governments issuing mine origin certificates as verifiable credentials to help their mining operators prove the provenance of their products when they export them abroad. Another thing that countries can do is to create incentives for increasing traceability. So if countries want to encourage operators to deploy traceability systems, they can use economic tools, such as, for example, for providing funding for developing technical infrastructure or tax credits to help operators develop those traceability systems. They can also use regulatory requirements, for example, by requiring operators to trace the provenance of products that are imported. And finally, one last thing that countries can do is to engage stakeholders in foreign jurisdiction, because as we were saying, supply chain collaboration is really important when it comes to traceability. And one of the things that we've seen is that it's sometimes difficult for data to be passed across jurisdictions and across borders. That may be due to the fact that there are some laws prohibiting the disclosure of information, or it may be due to the fact that some operators, particularly small-scale operators in producing jurisdictions, just don't have the technical infrastructure to actually collect the data and share it. And so one of the things that country can do is to actually go to these countries or go to these actors and try to collaborate with them to promote data sharing and reduce barriers. And that can take various forms. It can be technical assistance initiatives. It can be funding for operators located in foreign jurisdictions. It can be the transfer of technology and equipment, or it can even be exchange of best practice. So those are the steps in our roadmap. One thing I wanted to mention is that it's important to keep in mind that each mineral supply chain has a different risk profile. So as my colleague Alex was saying, it's important to keep in mind that different technologies and different solutions may be required for different mineral supply chains, and even a different degree of traceability may be required for different supply chains. So that's really important for governments to keep in mind.
Well, thank you to the team. So we'll now move to the Q&A section of this webinar. We have about 20 minutes left to take questions. So we encourage everyone to put your Q&A using the questions and answer feature. But here we just have the code and the link for you able to find the longer report. It's available on both the IEA and the OECD's website. So as we go into questions, we did have one request to take the floor from Kaisa Torreskainen from the Global Battery Alliance. If you're able to unmute, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Can you see me as well, or should I do something more?
We can't see you, but we can hear you. So
okay, fantastic. I will then just go with the voice. So thank you so much for inviting the Global Battery Alliance to contribute briefly to today's discussion. It has really been a pleasure for the GBA to increasingly collaborate with the IEA and OECD on this and other pieces of work. And congrats to both teams for this report and the perfect chain of custody during this presentation between the different team members. So anyone who doesn't know the GBA, we are a global multi-stakeholder alliance advancing sustainable battery value chains via the Battery Passport Program, which is a product-level sustainability certification for batteries implemented in a digital product passport infrastructure. And issuing such a certification for a battery, of course, requires tracing the supply chains of materials. Last year, the GBA piloted the battery passport with 10 consortia led by battery cell makers that together represent about 80% of the global battery market and are also GBA member companies. They traced select value chains of key battery minerals and gathered over 200 ESG reports from sites across all 5 continents, making this the world's largest pilot of traceability and sustainability reporting in the context of a battery passport. And I'd just like to highlight maybe 3 lessons from this exercise, which we also had the honor to contribute to the review of this report. First, it was a reality check on the state of traceability today. For battery minerals, traceability has a much broader and more complex scope than for conflict minerals, and some consortia that participated in the pilot were unable to map their full value chains all the way up to mining and refining, highlighting that we will, at least initially, probably be working with partially unknown and incomplete traceability and due diligence data, especially in parts of the value chain that are to date less exposed to traceability and transparency requirements, such as especially the midstream and recycled materials. So participating in the pilots provided a valuable opportunity to trial existing capabilities ahead of implementation of different regulatory requirements, such as the EU batteries regulation and others. Second, it highlighted, as the report also did, the importance of a pre-competitive and technology agnostic approach. The battery cell makers worked with various track and trace service providers and tested also in-house solutions for supply chain mapping and due diligence data collection. And interoperability, which is probably a word that nobody knew about 5 years ago, but now is on everybody's lips, between these different systems, and also flexibility between outsourced and in-house solutions should be built in, but with common rules for chain of custody and trustability and safeguarding of supply chain data. And developing these rules in a pre-competitive setting and being technology agnostic is really important for not locking into any single technology, but then also still embracing the efficiencies of technology. And thirdly, data disclosure and governance, which you also spoke about, are really at the crux of achieving an appropriate but realistic level of traceability and transparency. We identify that there are vastly different expectations on visibility to the supply chain only between supply chain actors. The downstream typically expects to have full visibility of their supply chains, while the upstream might be more comfortable reporting to their clients only, and then let alone stakeholder expectations. So in our multi-stakeholder setting, we will apply the lessons from these pilots and also the recommendations of this report to develop data exchange and assurance and disclosure rules that align with regulations, and also policy principles like the United Nations Secretary General's panel on energy transition minerals and others, to ensure that they are acceptable for also other stakeholders, and importantly, reward sustainability by increasing the share of traced and certified materials and products, including carbon footprint in the market. So these are some of the lessons that we learned and very much aligned with this report. And indeed, as we work together to define a necessary and feasible level of traceability, this report from the IEA and OECD is a great contribution and starter, and we'd like to congratulate and are happy to continue collaborating with you. And maybe just to end with a question, it would be great to hear a little bit more about the immediate envisioned next steps to implement the roadmap and the recommendations in this report.
which are connected to traceability. In terms of the IEA's and the OECD's further work program, we haven't yet developed that. So that's something that we'll be developing following some of those discussions with our members and our funders. Thank you for that, Kaisa. So just looking at the list of questions, I think I'll ask this one question, which seems to be more directed at the OECD colleagues. I just lost it. Which one was it? In the report, you mentioned third-party verification of mine sites, whereas the OECD guidance mentions third-party audits of smelters and refiners, part of step 4. What is the exact difference between verification and audit, and what would the consequences be?
Sure, thanks for the question, Martin. I think this is a question really of, I think it's fairly straightforward, actually. I mean, the main difference, obviously, is that step 4 is, a key section, a key recommendation of the OECD guidance. It's been adopted. It's already kind of a piece of soft law. And that's because of the importance of smelters and refiners as control points and the division of responsibility in terms of downstream companies mapping their supply chains to SORs and the smelters and refiners then taking a more granular approach to risks upstream. It's true that while the OECD guidance doesn't call in those words for specifically for third-party verification of mine sites, we do call for objective on-the-ground risk assessments. So, our joint report with the IEA, it isn't a copy-paste of the OECD guidance. We're really looking at measures that can stimulate or encourage effective traceability. And indeed, I think on-site third-party, whether it's third-party or it's joint or in some way, there are measures taken to ensure that it's objective, verification of mine sites and monitoring. I think that's totally aligned with the OECD guidance. Perhaps it's just kind of presenting it through a different lens in support of traceability.
So we have another question here that it's in this period where the ESG as a concept may have fallen out of favor in some quarters. Is traceability becoming a harder sell? And what benefit does traceability bring to those who are keenly interested in critical minerals but uninterested in ESG? And I'm happy to take a short crack at that myself and see if anybody else wants to join. I mean, we had one of our slides which is really pointing out that traceability as a concept does not inherently support any particular policy objective. It's more that it can be used as a tool to support a variety of different policy objectives. So we did have a strong lens looking at ESG criteria because that can certainly be one mechanism where you might use traceability. If you have ESG data from a mine site, if you can find a way to have a traceability system so that the end product can be connected verifiably with that data, that could give rise to ways, as we discussed, product differentiation, potential price differentiation, or companies that might use that information. Whatever a particular company thinks about ESG, if they have a certain requirement that is necessary to meet market entry requirements, say to enter into the EU, then companies would have a strong incentive to meet those traceability requirements to reach access to that market. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in, feel free, but if not, then we can go to another question. We had a question about the importance of interoperability protocols and wondering if there are any existing efforts on this front and how they can be supported by policymakers. Felix wants to start, and then maybe OECD if they want to add.
Yeah, so the answer is that there are existing efforts on this front. One big effort that we explain in the report is the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's Transparency Protocol, so the UNTP. And one of the things that is good about the UNTP is that it provides a basis for an interoperability protocol, but it allows governments or users to modify it as they see fit to adapt to particular supply chains. So one thing that countries could do is they use the UNTP as a basis and then they modify it to fit their own supply chains or their own economic context, and then further refine it, add additional technical elements, and then encourage operators within the jurisdiction to actually use that interoperability protocol. So that's one way in which governments can promote the development and use of interoperability protocols.
Thanks, Felix. So we had another question about when we talked about supply chain collaboration as one of the key elements to traceability system. How would that apply to a value chain that has several small players or low or non-existent data systems, thinking about rare earth elements and magnets and traceability in those supply chains? I'm wondering if we could elaborate on how traceability might apply in a system like that. Luca or Ben, do you want to jump in on that?
Thanks, Casey. Yes, I think the answer here, the key is the progressive approach and being practical. I mean, of course, there might not be a formalized, codified traceability system among smaller actors. But those same smaller actors will actually know their suppliers, who they're buying from, and same goes for their buyers. So it is a matter of slowly formalizing and building on actually existing knowledge with time-bound, agreed realistic objectives, with clear cut-off dates in case of non-compliance. And the issue really here is what could be the incentives for such a traceability system to be put in place. And this could happen with, for example, suppliers stepping in and making clear that this is an expectations, again, respecting this idea of progressive approach and progressively building on what's already out there. Or, for example, we could think about a price incentive, a price differential for suppliers that have those traceability systems in place.
So we had another. We had one quite provocative question on how traceability comes into play given the kind of multipolar world and the various geopolitics that we're seeing in the world between countries. And this is a very complex question, and I think the main, at least from the IEA's perspective, is that traceability is just one tool to allow information to flow along the supply chain. And ultimately, what policy objectives that information is used for is kind of a decision of individual governments and potentially by market players. Because one of the things that we've discovered in doing this report is that there are many instances where the market players may request traceability or encourage or expect traceability for a variety of different reasons that don't have anything to do with geopolitics. But at the same time, there are clearly policies that have that as an aim. I mean, we can think of many policies from across the European Union, the United States, and policies in China as well. And ultimately, understanding how traceability can function is really just in support of these broader policy objectives. And it doesn't solve the geopolitical crises, and it doesn't necessarily resolve those larger conflicts. I don't know if anybody else wants to add on that point as we're running close to the end.
Maybe I just quickly jump in here too. I mean, I think it definitely highlights, I mean, this is clearly a practical challenge, but it also highlights the fact that policymakers with distinct sets of overlapping goals, we kind of need to be thinking on multiple tracks simultaneously. So, of course, policymakers are concerned about certain trade dependencies in critical mineral supply chains, and that's certainly legitimate. Or simply looking at trade statistics can help kind of flag those dependencies and help ameliorate them. That's one question. But on the other hand, it does show how we still need to keep everyone at the table, at least for a minimum, a high minimum of information sharing, of trust around due diligence. And I think it's worth, in that regard, highlighting that there are a lot of shared interests around due diligence right now. I mean, just to give an example, the London Metal Exchange with their responsible sourcing requirements, Chinese audit schemes and other international audit schemes, they are subject to the same kind of assessments. So keeping that kind of those shared rules of the road in place, that's key to a level playing field, and it's key to trust.
I think as we're running out of time, I think maybe we'll go ahead and close. We didn't even come close to answering all the questions, so I think that just sends a signal for how interesting this topic is and how much debate there is among the various elements of it. So we do encourage anybody who's to reach out to us if you want to have a further discussion about different elements of the report. We're very happy to do that. And otherwise, I think I will just have a huge thank you to the audience, but also to the Natural Resources Canada for the support in this project and developing this project, and also to the OECD for the excellent collaboration. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.